Hello and welcome to this episode of Parley, the Hindu's weekly podcast, where we delve into pressing questions of public importance with insights from experts. I'm Aaratrika Bhaumik, your host for today. Question for this week is there a right to take offence? The popular YouTube show India's Got Latent has ignited a major controversy following the initiation of criminal proceedings against its creators and participants over allegedly objectionable remarks made in one of its episodes. On February 18th, the Supreme Court granted interim protection from arrest to podcaster Ranveer Allahbadia, one of the participants named in the FIRs. The bench, comprising Justice Surya Kant and N.K. Singh, also mooted the implementation of laws to regulate such online content, rekindling the debate on whether stringent criminal sanctions are warranted for contentious speech. To discuss this issue, we have with us today Justice Gautam Patel, former judge of the Bombay High Court, and Mr. Dushyant Dave, a senior advocate based in Delhi. I welcome you both. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you. Thank you.
If we could begin by hearing your preliminary thoughts on the issue. Justice Patel, I would like to come to you first on this. Is there a right to take offence at any form of speech? And does this right inherently fall within the reasonable restrictions outlined in Article 19, Subclause 2 of the Constitution?
Well, the question is, I think, somewhat wrongly put. There is no question of a right to take offence. That is not implicit anywhere. But there is a right to speech and there is a duty not to be offended, which is a slightly different thing. If you assume that there is a right to take offence, then that is a restriction on the right of freedom of speech under 19(1)(a), which is outside the parameters of Article 19(2) of the Constitution. The Article 19(2) doesn't speak of offensive speech, but it does speak of various things, including public order, decency, or morality. And that's the level of ambiguity that we are confronted with today. Not contempt of court, not defamation, not incitement to an offense, but public order, decency, and morality. There is no right to take offense or a right to be offended. It's the other way around. It's a duty not to be offended.
Right. Mr. Dave, do you agree with Justice Patel on this? Also, according to you, where should one really draw the line when it comes to defining the contours of free speech?
First and foremost, I think your question perhaps is meant to ask us whether citizens have a right to object to what Ranveer Allahbadia said in that talk. Citizens certainly have a right if somebody has committed an offense, and citizens have a right. I mean, if the state is not moving quickly, citizen can always move by filing a private complaint. So, I mean, in that sense, there is a right in every citizen. But the question is whether this right should be exercised in this fashion or not. Because if everybody starts filing complaints against somebody for the same offense, then it is going to be a chaotic situation, and it will result in a very serious prejudice to the defense of the alleged accused, and it will have serious repercussions on his liberty and his right to defend himself. So that's something different. But where do you draw the line? Well, the lines are well drawn, as Justice Patel very rightly pointed out, that free speech is always subject to certain exceptions. And one of the exceptions is decency and morality. Now, standards of decency and morality are different in different countries, and one country, they differ from time to time, from stage to stage. So, I mean, yes, in the context of what has been said, one can definitely say that the statements made were absolutely repulsive. They were really objectionable. They were disgusting. But whether they constitute a crime or whether they offend, Section 67 of the Information Technology Act or the provisions of the criminal law, I have my serious reservations about them. They are unpalatable and they should not have been spoken. And the speaker must be ashamed of himself, because he has not only shamed his own parents and his family, but everybody who has had some amount of liking or faith in this platform, and in the speaker himself, who has been hugely successful on his platform. So I think to that extent, yes, I mean, the line should have been drawn, and one should not be permitted to make this kind of extraordinarily repulsive statements. No, that's not done. Although I must also put it on record, and I'm sure Justice Patel will agree, that what he has said is definitely not right. But the kind of bad words that our society uses on a daily basis, if you go to streets and markets, you will hear people, saying these statements, which are virtually saying what this man has said. And that is something very seriously wrong with us, because, nobody bothers about who's standing around. Women are standing around, old people are standing around, decent people are standing around, and young people and many other people go on speaking these words, which I don't want to repeat on your show, but they really are extraordinarily offensive to our mothers and our sisters. So I think, and that's become part of a normal vocabulary across the country. That's a sad state of affairs, but it is so. So, I mean, I don't know where to draw line.
May I add to that a little bit?
Absolutely so.
What Dushyant is saying is absolutely correct. The worst sin, and I'm not putting it higher than that, in this entire controversy and what this man has said, is that it is just utterly unnecessary, meaningless, and downright stupid. It's completely pointless. There's nothing to be achieved by saying things like this. But that's quite a different thing from, and it's bound to give offense, but that's quite a different thing from saying that in 1902 that it violates the restrictions there and it crosses the line into decency or morality. That's a separate issue that has to be discussed, that has to be somewhat toned. Many of these stand-up comics really believe, and I don't know why, that using foul language is some sort of humor or it's intelligent. It's not. In fact, I don't know, on this there's a recent debate or exchange on Twitter or X between Kunal Kamra and Amish Tripathi. And I think the comment that Amish made is correct, that, if you use words that are polite and the tone remains calm, no matter what the content, the impact is greater. Why do people have to use offensive words to make a point? And in this case, I don't even know what the point was that was being sought to be made. And the whole thing was just completely gratuitous.
If we were to also look at how courts in the past have dealt with free speech cases, it has primarily been shaped by two distinct schools of thoughts. One is, of course, moral and paternalistic, based on the belief that such restrictions are necessary because human beings are inherently corruptible and prone to violence. The second is a more liberal view, where restrictions on free speech are imposed only when there is a direct and close proximity between speech and the presumed risk of public disorder. Mr. Dave, coming to you on this, which of these two schools of thoughts do you believe in?
Well, I am one of those who believes that no restriction should be imposed on free speech. And certainly not on citizens, except, when it is sedition leading to violence. If it is merely seditious, which doesn't lead to violence, I think one should really ignore such speeches. As Justice Patel rightly points out, that many a times people make irresponsible and stupid speeches. So, one has to ignore. I mean, society knows how to ignore. For example, what Ranveer has said, I'm sure society will punish him by boycotting his shows. I mean, and I'm sure he's not going to be more popular with that. As most time it happens when a film is attacked, it becomes more popular. But I hope that this time society realizes that the young man has crossed the line, and therefore, society must show some kind of a disdain for him. Having said that, I would say that, look, I mean, in this country, we are extremely conservative in our approach to freedom of speech. I would say that so long as you are not inciting violence, so long as you are not advocating, overthrow of the government, you should allow people to speak whatever they want to speak. And our politicians unfortunately get away by making hate speeches which are completely objectionable and which should never be permitted, but no action is being taken against them. For example, throughout the general elections, the speeches made by none other than Honorable Prime Minister were seriously objectionable. And neither the election commission nor any state police took any action about it. And the opposition also did not bring it to the notice of the concerned courts. So, these kind of things, you have to understand, citizens' freedom of speech is different from a politician's responsibility to behave in a particular way. And I would give much more latitude to citizen to express himself in any which way, so long as it does not violate decency, morality, public order, and does not seek to, overthrow the government. So to that, except that, I think there is no limitation to what citizen might be allowed to say and think freely.
May I put this? I agree with Dushyant on this, on the approach that is to be taken, Aaratrika, but let me just explain my view on this. And I'm not necessarily saying it's the view that has been accepted by other courts. It's my view and a view that I've taken in court, which is to say that the freedom of speech, 19(1)(a), has no boundaries other than those that are defined in Article 19(2). Article 19(2), the restrictions on freedom of speech is not expansive. Whereas 19(1)(a), the right to free speech, that right is expansive. It changes with media, it changes with time. It's like Article 21, it will change over time and it constantly expand. The restrictions are not expansive. They have to be narrowly tailored, and any law that the state makes, that's what 19(2) says, it empowers the state to make a law, must remain within the confines of Article 19(2). It can't go beyond that.
But I must also add to that, and Justice Patel knows about it, that throughout the Constituent Assembly debates, many members had voiced serious concern about insertion of sub-article 2 in Article 19.
That is correct.
They felt, or in fact, sub-articles 2 to sub-article 6, they felt that on the one hand, you are giving these freedoms. On the other hand, in the garb of under one pretext or the other, you are trying to restrict this freedom by allowing government to bring the laws. And there is no limit to those, laws being brought by the government. So many members wanted the rights to be unequivocal and without any, kind of a restraint as are provided in sub-articles 2 to 6. But that didn't happen. Dr. Ambedkar didn't agree to that. And he said that perhaps in the larger interest of the nation, you must have, reasonable restrictions which can be imposed by the state. Some members did feel that we should have absolute liberty.
Well, there is a limit, I would think, Dushyant, maybe you'll agree with me. There is a limit to what the state can do, because what the state can do in making a law is controlled entirely by Article 19(2), and it can't make a law outside of 19(2). That would be violative of the fundamental right to free speech and would make it vulnerable. But the fact that the state can make a law, and incidentally, that's an important point, that it has to be a law. It can't be executive action. There's an important distinction between the two. It can't be government action. It has to be a law. It has to be founded in law, the restriction. There has to be a statute.
Right, sir. Thank you. Some very valid points made by the two of you. Justice Patel, if I could just ask your opinion on this criticism that we see when it comes to the societal impact of, let's say, offensive speech. A lot of researchers have come up with studies which show that if the state were not to come down heavily on such offensive speech, then it could, let's say, have a proliferation of echo chambers in online spaces that we see a lot today, where individuals are exposed mainly to polarized views that they already agree with. Do you share such concerns?
Not really. I think this is an assumption that the reading or writing populace is infantile and can't make up its mind, and therefore it's back to that question of the state in the form of a paternalistic figure that has to control what we can read, write, digest, absorb, think about, and accept as our own. So I don't think there's much value to that. It's true that views tend to proliferate. They do. But there's always a counter, there's always a pushback.
Right, sir. Thank you. If we could now talk a little about the concept of constitutional morality, we have seen in the recent past, Supreme Court in a number of judgments have upheld the concept of constitutional morality when it decriminalized adultery as well as same-sex relations between consenting adults. Mr. Dave, coming to you, do you believe that in a mature democracy, constitutional morality serves as a very essential safeguard against the moral convictions of the majority?
Well, first, let me tell you one thing, that in the context of debate that we are having, constitutional morality has no role to play. And the Supreme Court's recognition of homosexuality, not being a criminal offense, or for that matter, any other issue, is not in the context of, constitutional morality. Constitutional morality is, what it means is that understanding and having love for the Constitution and implementing the spirit of the Constitution. That's entirely different. We are in the realm of statute law, and the statute law provides whether a particular act or particular speech is an offense or not. And it is in that limited context that we have to examine. It has nothing to do with constitutional morality. It certainly has something to do with the constitutional freedoms, because these freedoms are fundamental. But, you must understand one thing, apropos what you asked Justice Patel earlier also, that, over the centuries, these concepts have changed. I mean, somebody may find when he goes to, Khajuraho, that, these sculptures are absolutely objectionable. And how is it that in temples, this kind of, sex is depicted? So, these kind of things, I mean, Freud, for example, has himself written about, what Allahbadia has spoken, and he calls it Oedipus complex. Society evolves itself, society matures itself. And I feel that these are issues where, yes, I will definitely not like and approve of what Allahbadia has said. But I would say that these are things society has to, digest or reject as the case may be. And I have no doubt society will reject what he has said. And we should leave that matter to rest at that. We should not be really going beyond what has happened. I mean, it was a serious mistake on the part of the young man who has a bright future otherwise. And I have no doubt that he is repenting it beyond imagination.
Thank you, sir. Justice Patel, do you share the same views with Mr. Dave?
Yes, and I want to add that we can't take this phrase constitutional morality as something that is a given. There is a deeper understanding about it. There's an excellent article of 2010 by Pratap Bhanu Mehta in Seminar where he explores what is meant by constitutional morality to begin with. And Ambedkar's view, based on the scholar George Groth, is one thing, but does it refer to the form of the Constitution? Does it refer to the processes of the Constitution? What is it talking about? It has no role to play in what we are discussing today. Yeah, I agree with Dushyant Dave. We're talking about substantive law.
We spoke about constitutional morality, and both of you were of the opinion that it's not really relevant when it comes to interpretation of statute law. If we could now move on to the discussion about the laws governing obscenity in the country. Justice Patel, coming to you, can a profane speech necessarily be considered an obscene speech? Do judicial precedents that we have now, do they support this view?
Not at all. Profanity is not in and of itself invariably obscene. I was saying that the word profane is not necessarily obscene, and the two are not synonymous. The Article 19.2 doesn't use the word obscenity, it doesn't use the word profanity. It doesn't use either of these expressions. A profanity has to be used in contradiction to that which is sacred, which is a completely different thing altogether.
Right. Mr. Dave, what is your view on this? I know you told us earlier in the podcast about community standards as to, that is the standard we should really see when it comes to determining whether a profane speech qualifies as an obscene speech.
See, obscene is not defined either under the criminal laws nor under the Information Technology Act, Section 67. But as far as I recall, the Constitution Bench of Supreme Court in Udeshi's case, which dealt with that famous book, Lady Chatterley's Lover, There, the Supreme Court said it should be offensive to the modesty or decency. It should be lewd. It should be filthy. It should be repulsive. So they defined it in a large, broader sense. But then again, test of obscenity is a question of degree, and it varies with moral standards of society in question at different times. So, I feel that over the centuries, we have gone inwards rather than becoming more liberal. As I was giving you example of Khajuraho, temples, or for example, Sun Temple in Modhera in Gujarat. If you see the sculptures, people will wonder that why is it that they, depicted sex so openly about it, and sex in every form. But today, when we talk about sex on public platforms, people say, "Oh, it shouldn't be discussed. It shouldn't be talked about. It's offensive. It's obscene." Now, therefore, I personally feel that obscenity is very difficult to define as broadly as one would like to. It should be in a given fact situation, whether this is something which really has hurt the sentiment of an individual, and particularly in the context of women in the society, whether it is intended to hurt their modesty or their womanhood. So I think it's in that context essentially obscenity has to be described, because earlier Supreme Court has also said that a naked painting per se may appear to be somebody to be obscene, but if it is an matter of art, then it is not obscene. So these are all issues which are extremely, I would say, difficult to define once and for all.
Aaratrika, this is actually a journey of 50 years of law, or maybe even a little more. 1964, Ranjit Udeshi, the case that Dushyant just mentioned, is a case which adopted what is known as the Hicklin test, based on an 1868 or 1867 English judgment, which basically looked at, defined obscenity to mean anything that is likely to deprave or corrupt minds that are likely to be influenced by exposure to it. Now, 50 years later, the Supreme Court's taken a different stand in Avik Sarkar in 2014, where it has adopted a community standards test, which is the more contemporary test, and which is exactly what I think Dushyant is speaking about today, which is what is a community standard. But this community standard today is very hard to define. It's very amorphous. What is the community standard today? Are we not supposed to talk about sex at all, as Dushyant is pointing out? What happens to all our art? What happens to all our ancient sculptures? Is that supposed to be ignored, eradicated? These are not questions. This is not obscenity. Over the world, the tests of obscenity have evolved. And in fact, today, I doubt you'd find anybody who would say that Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence is not considered a work of great literature, but is obscene, which was the view in 1964.
There is a brilliant, lines by Justice Krishna Iyer in that famous Raj Kapoor's case, in Satyam Shivam Sundaram case. And Justice Krishna Iyer puts it very brilliantly. This is the dilemma that courts face every day. He says, the relation between reality and relativity must haunt the court's evaluation of obscenity, expressed in society's pervasive humanity, not law's penal prescriptions. Social scientists and spiritual scientists will broadly agree that man lives not alone by mystic squints, ascetic chants, and austere abnegation, but by luscious love of beauty, sensuous joy of companionship, and moderate non-denial of normal demands of the flesh. So he quotes Oscar Wilde, who says moderation is a fatal thing. Nothing succeeds like excesses. So, this is how courts have looked at it. It's a very difficult, challenge before even judges. And Justice Patel, who has been a brilliant judge of this country, I'm sure he was also confronted at some stage or the other of his judicial career that this is not easy to really define, much less to decide.
Right, and like both of you mentioned, courts have to be cognizant of the evolving standards of morality in society. Mr. Dave, you've mentioned earlier how there is rarely any action taken when it comes to hate speeches by politicians. In fact, a recent study published by the Washington based research group India Hate Lab found a 74.4% increase in hate speeches against minorities by politicians in 2024, especially during their Lok Sabha election campaigns. Do you see this as a case of misplaced priorities going after comedians when this is the state of hate speeches in the country? Further, despite several Supreme Court strictures, why do we not see any change on the ground?
Nobody in power likes criticism, whether it is done through a comedian or whether it is done through a civil society member or a critic like we are. So, generally those in power do not want any criticism. And therefore, they, when they find that the comedians are able to reach out to a large section of the society through their comedy and telling the reality of what the politicians and those in power are doing, they feel little threatened. And this is not today. I mean, this has been going on for centuries and centuries, that I'm sure emperors also didn't like or the kings didn't like such comedy. And I have no doubt that democracy anywhere in the world does not, permit such comedians to have a free run. But they should have a free run. I feel that a society which does not allow criticism of those in power is a closed society. And the basic tenet of democracy is that it must be an open society where everybody must have a right to say something. And comedians put it brilliantly. Of course, they should not use the bad words, as Justice Patel rightly pointed out. The comedy does not necessarily involve using foul language. And you can do it in much better way, which they do most times. But so I think, yes, targeting of comedians is absolutely objectionable. Many of them have been arrested in the past. And that is really a sign of authoritarianism which has been prevailing in the country in recent, and this is not confined to a political party. I have seen this kind of action against critics and comedians taking place in Bengal, in Tamil Nadu, and many other places. So I think no politician really likes to allow or to have a free hand to comedians. So that's something I think I'm really, yes, I feel that society is very, I would say we should be intolerant towards hate speeches. We should have zero tolerance. We cannot allow, anybody to be targeted, much less, minority community who the majority have a duty to protect in every possible way. And I feel that we are becoming numb to this kind of hate speeches, unfortunately, as a majoritarian nation, which is not what should happen. Every member of the society should be troubled by and pained by the hate speeches which are made by those in power against any section of the society, be it minority, be it opposition, be it critics, be it stand-up comedians. I think this kind of nonsense must stop. Politicians must grow. They must become much more mature. They have a lot to talk about. They must talk about positively about many things that they do. And I have no doubt that there are many things to talk about positively. So why is it that they, go into this negativity? In this country, unfortunately, you open up any television channel in the evening, all that we see is nothing but negativity. And, the kind of tirade which the mainstream television spreads in the evenings is disgusting. I mean, it is really repulsive to see that anchor after anchor talks about things which should not be talked about in their shows. They should really respect every dignity of every citizen of this country. And, they should make sure that the politicians, are asked questions that why is it that you are doing this? You should not be saying things which you have said. I mean, nobody questioned Prime Minister throughout the election campaign. When he made virtual, he was poking fun at the largest minority, the Muslims in the country, in every possible speech and in every possible manner, which is not, it doesn't befit. After all, he's the prime minister of the country. If he, uses this kind of language, then why should others not follow him? And they do. So it's a sad commentary. And I feel that we should become a more responsible society, more mature society, and more sensitive society than what we are.
Let me steer this back to the class rather than any individual, Aaratrika, because what the question is about comedians. Now, let's understand what the purpose of comedy and stand-up comedy is. There is essentially making fun, poking fun at people. It is holding up a mirror to society, showing the incongruities, showing the absurdities in life, getting people to not only laugh about it, but also at themselves. And in that process, to question what they're doing, whether it is right or wrong. It serves a valuable purpose. It's a form of social commentary. You have to see it like this. Now, I'm not excusing, mind you, again, I'm not excusing the use of four-letter words and offensive or profane language, because according to me, profanity is not humor. It's just an indication of thoughtlessness. Anybody can do that. Intelligent comedy doesn't need to use language like this, but it does need to hold up a mirror to society and tell us, look how absurd you are. Why are you all thinking like? There's nothing wrong with that. Part of that process is also an exaggeration, just like a cartoonist will exaggerate certain facial features and so on and so forth to make the cartoon. Stand-up comedy is not very different. It's exactly, it comes to this. The targeting of of comedians is not only unfortunate, but it is reprehensible. If you want it in two lines, there's a Latin maxim. Of course, there's a Latin maxim for everything. But this one, in joco veritas, tells you that in jest, there is truth. And frankly, I agree with Dushyant entirely that the only thing not to be tolerated is intolerance. We absolutely have to be a far more liberal, tolerant, accepting society, that there will be views that are markedly divergent from ours, that may even cause us offense, but our options are to respond or to turn away, not to attack the messenger. That's my view.
Right, Justice Patel. Justice Patel, if you could also address the lack of enforcement that we see of Supreme Court guidelines on hate speech, the Tehseen Poonawalla guidelines. In fact, even in 2023, the Supreme Court had directed states to register suo motu FIRs against hate speech. Why do we still see such institutionalization of hate speech even now?
But what is this regulation that you're in search of? How much will you regulate? That's the point I was making. Free speech is not regulated. Hate speech is and should be actionable. That's the point that Dushyant is making. Hate speech, wherever it occurs, must be actionable. You don't need guidelines. Hate speech, you recognize it. When it happens, you recognize it and you have to act on it. The point Dushyant is making is that we are not acting on hate speech when it is clearly hate speech, regardless of where it comes from. That's the point. You don't need guidelines for this. And this constant obsession with having rules, guidelines, regulations, we are barely able to follow traffic rules in this country. Why do you want more regulations?
Right. So, coming to you, this is the last question for the evening. What are some of your concerns when it comes to regulating free speech in society today, where we see so much of polarization? If we could talk about a couple of instances in the recent past, we have seen the Draft Broadcasting Services Regulation Bill, which was, of course, rolled back by the government. We've also seen effort to establish a fact-check unit of the government under the amended IT Rules 2023. And I believe that such efforts will only intensify after this particular incident. So if you could just share some of your concerns regarding such efforts.
Sorry, just 1 minute. I think the entire question is wrong. Where is the question of regulating free speech? The question is not of regulating free speech. The question is of assessing whether the restrictions on free speech are or are not constitutionally valid. Once you start regulating free speech, it's the thin end of the wedge. Then everybody is consuming uniform amounts of pap. There is conformity. About free speech is that we don't want to have complete conformity. We want dissent. We want opposing points of view. We want to be pluralized, or in your words, polarized. What's wrong with the polarized society? What democracy isn't polarized? What does polarization mean? It means there are widely divergent points of view. What's wrong with that? That's how it should be. It should be noisy. It should be chaotic. Otherwise, what? It's a dictatorship. That's the essence of freedom here.
My concern.
I don't know if Dushyant agrees.
No, I agree with you, but my concern is different, and that is this: that the laws exist today as to what is objectionable and what is not objectionable. We must understand that. So, question is, those laws are not being enforced in the first instance, and if at all they are being enforced in a selective manner.
There I agree with you.
If therefore the hate speech is objectionable, why is it that you are picking up only opposition leaders or some critics of the government and alleging that they are guilty of hate speeches, and when it comes to those in power or the members of the ruling party, you are not willing to take any action? What really this country needs is strict accountability and a very fair and balanced application of the laws. So we don't want at one stage any non-provocative statement to be labeled as seditious and people being hauled up, before the courts. It happened. I was reading in paper yesterday that some, lady bureaucrat in Assam put her picture on Instagram or somewhere. Somebody commented saying that, "Madam, you are not with the makeup," but somebody else put an emoji of laughter, and that person who put that emoji is now being prosecuted. Now, we have become a society where we don't want to take action for the right reason, but we want to take action for the wrong reasons against innocent people. That is what has to stop. And real problem is that I must say, with great respect to Justice Patel and my judiciary, that the real problem is that the judges, especially at the lowest level, are not aware of the law or are not implementing the law in a particular way and in a right way. And as a result of that, innocent people are suffering. They are being dragged to the courts.
But you don't have to apologize, Dushyant. I agree with you.
So, that is something which is troublesome. I think this is where we really need to move forward. If we really want a vibrant society, if we really want a real vibrant democracy, we must ensure that freedom of speech is protected to the hilt. But at the same time, its abuse in any form must be punished as far as law provides it.
Right. This brings us to the conclusion of today's discussion. Thank you, Justice Patel. Thank you, Mr. Dave. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.